Story 1. Pure horror. I am in North Jersey, directly outside of New York City. My mom and sister both worked in the city, and I couldn't reach them. All cell phone lines were busy. They couldn't get back to New Jersey until late at night by ferry because all of the bridges and tunnels were shut down. Story 2. Once it was apparent that it was more than one hijacking, I started to wonder how many planes could suddenly be dropping out of the sky. Story 3. I was 7 years old when I saw the explosion on television, and I said, "Cool." I was told it was, in fact, not cool. Story 4. I was at work for a company contracted by Xerox to make meter readings for copy machines in businesses. We were calling businesses in those buildings. Once we realized what was happening, we were sent home for the day. It was a surreal experience. Story 5. I was in high school in math class when the principal let everyone go home after the second plane hit. The first plane could have been an accident, but after the second plane hit, it was clear it was deliberate. Most people didn't know what to think, except for the horror and sadness felt for those affected. Story 6. Changed my life. I live in New York. Friends lost parents. It affected me deeply for a long time, and I will never be the same. Story 7. I was 6, so I just kind of accepted that it was something that happened. There is a person in charge called the president, and we have to vote for them. I suppose that's fine. I have to go to school every year? Okay, sure. Buildings blow up? That's strange. But who am I to question things? Story 8. My daughter lived and worked in Manhattan, specifically about a block away from the World Trade Center. My initial reaction was worry for her. She wisely chose to email, as the phone lines were jammed, so I soon knew she was home safe. Then my feelings shifted to gut-wrenching disbelief. It was almost impossible to comprehend. Story 9. I am in the United Kingdom. I was with my dad in Cambridge. We were in a huge crowd of people around a television in a shop window showing the news when the second plane hit. I knew nothing would be quite the same. I went home to my boyfriend's house and ran in, asking whether they had seen what had happened. They were sitting in silence, and I realized something else had occurred. Their oldest son had committed suicide that day. He was struggling with addiction. I will never forget that day for many reasons, as so many things were not the same again and never have been since. Many negative events happened afterward, both personally and globally. I see it as a before and after, and I am not even American. I feel a heaviness and deep sadness when I think of that day. Story 10. I was highly suspicious of it just being an accident, as that was what was said before the second plane hit. I am a pilot and live close enough that my weather is generally New York City's weather, and it was what we call severe clear that morning. An accident simply did not make sense. The second plane removed all doubt. Story 11. I was a junior in high school in Colorado, but my dad lived in New York City. I had a job moving appliances at Sears before they opened, so I saw the news on all the TVs. I started to panic a little, and my boss got angry that I was looking at the TVs and turned them all off. I didn't fully understand the significance until a few hours later when I got to school. Then there was a communication blackout that lasted for days before I heard that my dad was all right. He lived in Queens, but I had never been to New York City and didn't realize how big it was. Story 12. I was on a treadmill working out at a gym in the MetLife building, a large office building in Midtown Manhattan, right above Grand Central Station. When I was watching the Today Show, they were doing a segment on a book I was interested in, and I remember getting annoyed that they kept interrupting the piece to talk about the plane. At first, Matt Lauer made it sound like it was a small two-person plane and was no big deal. By the time I realized that something serious was going on, I was the only person in the gym. I ran downstairs to Grand Central and just got on what turned out to be the last train out before they shut the system down. At some point on the ride, a woman got hysterical because she heard that the tower had collapsed, and many people got angry at her for spreading what we all thought was hysteria and nonsense. When I finally got home, my wife was with our kids, who were then 2 and 4 years old, in a park and obviously had no idea what was going on. One look at my sweet daughter's innocent and happy face made me start bawling. Story 13. I was supposed to head into New York City for work that day. I was heading to the shop to load up my work van when the first plane hit. I was listening to Howard Stern. Story 14. I was on one of the last two Metro North trains leaving Grand Central as the first plane hit. I had no idea until I received a phone call from my grandmother, who was in Connecticut, where I was headed. She was watching it on television and telling me what was happening, and I couldn't process it. When we arrived in New Haven, everyone in the station was crowded around the TV, and as soon as I saw the footage, I broke down. Story 15. It was horrifying. The first plane went down, and we all thought it was an accident. Then the second plane crashed. My husband and I were glued to the television, which was a mistake. I saw people jumping from the towers. It was devastating. I finally had to turn off the news and go for a walk. In the days that followed, things felt surreal. There were no airplanes flying. It seemed like the entire country was in mourning. I had a friend who worked at the Pentagon. The plane hit not far from his desk. His wife was on the phone with him when it happened. He still experiences post-traumatic stress disorder, and airplanes still startle him. Story 16. I was 11. I was too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of the situation. I knew it was bad, but I didn't understand that it would become one of the defining events of this century. In hindsight, I suppose September 11th was the day I realized the world wasn't what I thought it was. Story 17. I was in college directly next to an airport near Somerset. There was panic everywhere, with everyone trying to leave campus as no one was sure what was happening. It was scary and incredibly sad. Story 18. I am a television makeup artist. I was called in immediately for a catastrophic event and was told not to even brush my teeth. I needed to get there right away. Story 19. At first, they mentioned the Pentagon, then the World Trade Center, and I was frustrated because I felt the news couldn't get it right. My neighbor was Hani Hanjour, the hijacker involved in the Pentagon attack. I lived near him in January 1999. I didn't learn this until a news reporter came to my apartment and told me in October 2021. His roommate had a BMW, and he would be dropped off in different cars all the time. I remember him skipping stairs. He was not very friendly. I used to leave my front door wide open, but now I don't trust my neighbors. Story 20. That week we began watching portions of West Wing for the first segment of social studies class, so we had the television cart positioned front and center. However, when we were filtering into our seats, the news was already on in the classroom as our teacher was watching it with another teacher before class started. The class convened, and roll call was occurring with the news still on. We all watched the second plane hit. It was shocking. We never started West Wing and continued watching when the Pentagon was hit. My social studies teacher, who was over 50 years old, exclaimed an inappropriate word. My high school was only a few miles from the Pentagon, and a significant number of students' parents worked there. Almost immediately, it seemed, there was an announcement for all students to make their way to the cafeterias. We nervously waited there. Some classmates had parents in the Pentagon, while others had parents who commuted via Amtrak to the World Trade Center. My father had done so for a few years but stopped in 2000. Then the buses arrived, and students started heading home. It was chaotic as the staff tried to identify which students had families to return to, not only due to work but also regarding potential family fatalities. I think there was only one. The initial reaction was guttural, quiet, and dizzying. Story 21. I was living in New York City, Brooklyn, when I turned on the television and fell out of bed. I tried to call my mom, but the cell towers were down. Instinct led me to the closest payphone and then to the waterfront to watch the towers fall. I fainted again, and a stranger caught me. Story 22, Mountain Time Zone, 4th grade. We were supposed to have a spaghetti dinner that night hosted by the school. I was really excited for it and probably annoyed my classmates. I watched it happen on Fox and Friends, and then they took us to school, where I fixated on that as we lined up before class. One of my friends said, "Emily, yesterday you couldn't stop talking about the spaghetti dinner, and today about the plane crashes." Then one of my teachers explained female genital mutilation to us, and I feared that for about a year. Story 23. I was in the 82nd Airborne Division. We were all convinced we would be called up at any moment. I gathered every spare piece of equipment I could find for our vehicles. Story 24. I was shocked to see the skyline from my house, where I could see the towers burning. My husband worked at a hospital and was not allowed to come home as they were expecting to get patients from the city. But those patients never arrived because the towers fell. Story 25. My wife was working that day. She worked in the Sears Tower and did not know what was happening. I called her and told her to come home. I did not want a plane crashing into the Sears Tower and taking her from me. Story 26. I was having breakfast at a beach restaurant in Mexico when it happened. The staff told me about it and suggested I should go watch the news. I knew at that moment that everything was about to change for the worse. I realized that the United States was starting a long decline. I ended up staying in Mexico for an extra week. There was a loud sigh of relief from all the passengers on the plane when it touched down. The place I returned to was not the same place I had left. It never felt like home again. People really became unhinged at that time. For me, the change was palpable. It was easy to see from my perspective. Eventually, I left for good in 2009. I hear that it's more unhinged there these days. Story 27. I was watching it live. It was absolute horror when the second plane hit because we then knew it wasn't just an accident. They canceled my college classes in North Carolina as a result, so the gravity really sank in. Story 28. I am glad I am still 3 years from the draft. To be honest, even at 14, I basically just saw it for what it was. A relatively small but incredibly effective attack against a nation. It was terrorism, but compared to the things it eventually led to, it was actually a very small incident. If I had known at the time the level of nationalism and the devastating separation it would cause in the political landscape of our country, I would have been more worried than I was back then. Hyper-radicalizing a small segment of the population into what would become a fascist voting base 20 years later was something I never could have predicted. Story 29. When I heard they hit the Pentagon, I was sure this was World War III, probably the most historic day I have lived through. Hopefully not so far. Story 30. I said there will be a war. I had no idea there would be 2 wars, never declared by Congress, and one of them was based on a lie. No one would ever prosecute George Bush for telling that lie, for creating a torture program, or for the war crimes during his presidency. Story 31. I was in the Air Force and we were in the middle of an exercise playing war games. We immediately went from play mode to getting ready for the real deal. Looking back, it was impressive how seamless the transition was. Since we didn't have televisions at work, we didn't get to see what was going on until we got home that night. Story 32. I was in kindergarten when I remember Sister Genevieve turning on the box television. I saw the first tower burning from the plane's impact and later witnessed the second tower get hit. We went home early that day, and when I arrived, we continued to watch it on TV. The first tower had already collapsed, and we saw the second tower collapse as well. I didn't realize then that it was a terrorist attack. I just remember that everyone was home early that day, even my dad, who usually worked 12 hours a day. Story 33. I was about 12 or 13 and at school when I found out. I was always very aware of human behavior, as I grew up in an intensely abusive situation. So when I got to school and most classes had those huge TV carts turned on and tuned to the news, I paid attention. The teachers were running back and forth between classes, whispering in the doorways and looked scared. The students were all having a blissfully unaware time, not having to do any work and not getting in trouble for messing around. It was history class, and I had been watching the news because that was what the teachers were doing. The first plane had already hit, and reporters were speculating. My teacher was standing next to the TV, wide-eyed and terrified. I went up and stood next to him, also watching. I was an odd child, very stoic, matter-of-fact, and fearless. Not in a reckless way, but in a more unsettling manner. Understanding that bad things happen and I would face them. So when the second plane hit live on television, and my history teacher stood there frozen in horror, I turned to him and said with a completely blank face, "This means war." He looked at me as if I were one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I just turned and went back to my seat, sat down, and pulled out a book to read. Not bothered at all. Story 34. It's my earliest memory. I was 5 when I came home and saw my mom cry for the first time. It was strange because in my 5-year-old mind, my mom had the answer to everything. She never cried. She was standing in the kitchen, looking at the television with her hand over her face, sobbing. It was her birthday. Story 35. As a Brit, I was walking home from school after an early finish when I overheard 2 women talking about the towers in New York falling down. When I got home, my dad was staring at the news, shocked. I later found out he was annoyed because the breaking news interrupted his show. Story 36. I remember a terrorism expert during the first Gulf War saying to expect retaliation later on. Story 37. I had a unique perspective that day, as I was not near a television but instead listening to the radio. I had skipped school as a senior because I was searching for my girlfriend, who had attempted to take her life and was in one of 5 hospitals. It rained the entire day, and I found myself wondering what was happening in my world at that moment. It was one of the strangest and most out-of-body experiences of my life. Story 38. I remember it feeling like something bad was happening, but I couldn't fully understand just how awful it was. A few of my classmates had parents who picked them up from school, and that's when it started feeling scary. I remember going home and seeing compilations of people jumping from the buildings they were trapped in. I couldn't really comprehend how horrific that was either. Eventually, I tried to watch my usual cartoons to distract myself, but that was impossible. Channels you would never expect to show anything serious were running coverage of September 11th all day. Story 39. I found it odd that they knew all the names and countries of origin of the hijackers seemingly moments after the news began reporting it. They also had a video of Osama bin Laden celebrating the attack but not actually taking responsibility for it, which they looped repeatedly to create a sense of correlation. I do not trust videos of any modern narrative that attempts to explain it differently. I remember what I witnessed very vividly. If you could compartmentalize your emotions, everything seemed extremely suspicious from the beginning. Although the early conspiracy videos about September 11th, 2001 got many details wrong, they also contain some very important footage of the event and news interviews that can only be interpreted based on what you see and hear with your own eyes and ears. Story 40. I called my wife. We lived in Washington, D.C., specifically Arlington, Virginia, not far from the Pentagon. I had a basement home office. My usual routine was to go downstairs, turn on the TV, and let the news play in the background while I started work. That's how I learned what was happening. I told her to leave the office immediately and come home right away. She worked in D.C., not far from the Farragut West Station. She often biked to work, a habit I encouraged. She made it home in about 30 to 45 minutes, while everyone else was stuck in standstill traffic on the D.C. roads, and the metro was not operating. Biking, boys and girls, is the best way to navigate the city in an emergency. Story 41. I was sick that day and stayed home from school. I was the only one at home. I woke up and turned on the news right as the second tower was hit. I thought I was dreaming because of how surreal it was and went back to sleep. When I woke up a few hours later, I realized it was all real, but the shock had worn off because I had thought it was only a dream. The only emotion I felt at that point was that sinking feeling in my stomach when you know something really bad either happened or will happen next. I knew everything had changed in our country that day. We were attacked, and it felt like anything could happen. For those of us who knew nothing about Osama bin Laden or the anti-American sentiment stemming from United States policies in the Middle East, it was truly horrifying to see and seemed to come out of nowhere. Most people in America did not understand the rationale for the attacks. That was Osama bin Laden's biggest error, which invoked the full wrath of the country against the entire Islamic world. His poorly made cave videos were not translated for the American public, and as a child, I believed the attacks occurred because they were people who hated freedom. Islamophobia in the United States was significantly bolstered due to bin Laden and his group of extremists. I distinctly recall many people demanding we use nuclear weapons on the entire Middle East. Send the savages to hell and let the devil sort them. That kind of thinking was rampant in the United States until the invasion of Iraq. Even today, I still hear people sincerely ask why we didn't just nuke them all. The visceral hatred in response to September 11th was real and still influences the opinions of quite a few Americans. For anyone thinking terrorism is an effective way to push an agenda, it is not, unless the majority of the population understands why the attack is happening. I'm sure some intelligent people in the United States knew, but most of us common folk at the time did not. Osama bin Laden did more to solidify negative sentiment against his cause than he ever did to help it. It could be argued that the general idea many Americans had, and some still have, of the Middle East being a savage place was predominantly due to al-Qaeda and bin Laden. Hence the nuke them all mentality. I would say that the callous indifference that a significant portion of Americans have toward the Palestinians in Gaza is also an extension of the consequences of September 11th. I would even argue that the extreme conservative push in global politics was due to September 11th and similar attacks around the world. Violence begets violence. That is the true legacy of September 11th. Nothing good came from it, and it should serve as a warning in history books about the unintended consequences of violence and terrorism to promote an agenda. Story 42. I was holding my 24-year-old child, who is now 5 months old, as I turned on the television just before the second plane hit. I cannot believe the conspiracy theorists who claim our government orchestrated this or that it was staged. It makes me truly angry. Anyone who witnessed this tragedy live can attest that it was very real. Story 43. Horror, disbelief, helplessness, and sorrow for the victims. I immediately called my good friend who worked in Manhattan. She informed me that she was off that day, but her co-workers were caught in the dust. Story 44. It's not my story, but someone I know told me that they thought it was a trailer for a new movie. Later, they realized it's real. Story 45. I was getting ready for school. My mom always had the news on in the morning, so we knew that a plane had hit but hadn't yet learned it was intentional. I remember telling her I thought it looked very serious and that I didn't want to go to school. She said, "Oh, you'll be fine. Things like this happened in my country all the time, and I'm fine." I made it to my first class, and our teacher had the television on. We all watched the second plane hit. After that, we were sent home for the day. It was a big, I told you so moment. Story 46. While watching TV that morning, one of my kids asked, "What's happening?" My response was, "The world is changing. Watch so you can tell your kids about it." In the United States, there is life before September 11th and life after September 11th. Story 47. I saw the second plane hit live on television while eating my breakfast. I was in high school and had a morning spare, so I was still at home. This may sound made up, but I went to school and found my friends, and we talked about it. I told them I thought Osama bin Laden was behind it. I had seen a biography episode about him on the A&E network that summer. The episode mentioned the attack on the USS Cole and essentially concluded by saying we are not sure where he will attack next or something along those lines. I felt smart for knowing this, but it was also such a surreal day. Story 48. I was 6 years old, living with a single mother in California. I didn't react at all. It happened before school, and my teachers were in shock. I just wanted to play basketball. Story 49. I said out loud, "This can't be right. What's happening?" I thought it was an internet hoax, so I checked a few sites and then found someone with a television in a college dorm. I saw it on the news. Story 50. I heard it on the radio during a 6 a.m. class in California and thought it was some kind of radio station joke. When I went to class, it was on the TV, and the professor knew we wanted to leave, so he told us to go home. I went to work, and they told us to go home at noon. Story 51. I was scared and crying. I grew up and went to elementary school in Washington, D.C. My mother worked a few blocks from the White House. Once the plane crashed into the Pentagon, my school went into lockdown. They took us to the gym in the basement, and we silently sat there while the teachers watched things unfold on an old television. Many kids were crying, some silent and unaware of the gravity of the situation. I cried briefly. Then I remember being home from school days later, just watching the replay of the incidents. Story 52. Confusion. My mother told me, "You don't know this now, but this is a huge deal." I tried to understand it but simply could not, so I gave up and went to play with something. Story 53. I saw the rubble of the first tower, and then I saw the plane hit the second. I was in shock. What sticks with me more than anything else is a woman, a flight attendant, who called her husband. They aired the short conversation. She called him to tell him that she was on a plane that had been hijacked, that she didn't know how much time she had, but she wanted to tell him she loved him. I remember her voice and his, the tears, and the silence afterward. I will never forget her, her husband, or the innocence that was lost that day. I will never forget the naivety that we all lost. Mostly, I will never forget her or her bravery and courage in the face of an impossible situation. Story 54. I had no idea. I was home alone with the flu, in bed sleeping when it happened, and I didn't find out until that night. I may have been one of the last people to learn about it. Story 55. I was 14 and lived in the DMV area. I wasn't sure if my dad was working in the Pentagon that day because sometimes he did and other times he worked at the National Security Agency. Story 56. I had moved to Colorado from New Jersey a year earlier. I was sleeping in because I had attended the Broncos and Giants game the night before. My sister called me to tell me to turn on the television, and I did just in time to see the second plane hit. My first thought was how many people I knew that worked at the towers. I knew two and neither made it out. Story 57. First, I told my college roommate, who was watching CNN, next time something like this happens in the morning, please wake me up. My next thought was, this probably guarantees Bush in 2004. Story 58. I was a missionary in Illinois at the time. We were out knocking on people's doors that morning and weren't getting anywhere as usual. No one said anything, and we weren't allowed to watch television or listen to the radio, so we had no idea what was going on. We went back to our apartment, and the neighbor came banging on our door, raving about going to war and that there were planes falling out of the sky everywhere. We went to his apartment and saw the footage of the towers falling, resulting in stunned silence. We ended up spending the day at a local church member's house watching the news. The weirdest thing was when we heard jet engines overhead and suddenly realized all planes were grounded. We ran outside and saw the presidential aircraft and its fighter escort on their way back to Washington, D.C. In the days and weeks that followed, we were all worried about getting drafted. Most missionaries are young men aged 19 to 22, making us prime military draft age. The lack of outside information made it all too easy to get caught in a crazy sort of echo chamber regarding that kind of situation. Story 59. In college, we watched the news in disbelief. I honestly felt sad and scared. Story 60. I called my best friend, who was about to head out for a flight to New York City, and told him he was not going anywhere and needed to turn on the news. Story 61. I was 17 in my senior year of high school. I didn't know much about air traffic or global politics, and our country had never been attacked. So, my frame of reference was basically nothing. Wow, that's shocking. I wonder what went wrong for a plane to hit a building. Why is this a big enough deal that they are interrupting class to show the news? Wait, do we get the whole day off to watch the news? Why are the adults so sad? A second plane? What is going on with air traffic control today? More locations? The Pentagon? This is a serious problem. Today's date, September 11th, is now associated with an emergency. Did they do this on purpose to send us a message? That is terrifying. How much longer will this go on? How many more targets are there? Where will they be? Those are people falling out of the buildings. They aren't falling. They're jumping. What's going to happen now? This doesn't happen here. What is going on? Story 62. I was only 6, but I vividly remember being afraid that every airplane I saw in the sky was going to crash into my house on purpose. Story 63. I was 11 when it happened, and at that age I was obsessed with New York City landmarks. I had never been to New York City, so they all seemed mystical and legendary. My initial reaction was sadness, thinking I would never be able to visit the World Trade Center now. I couldn't really grasp the idea of thousands of people dying at the same time, so this was all I cared about. Story 64. I was in 7th grade, getting ready to leave for school. I remember turning on the news shortly after the first tower was hit. At first, I thought it might have been an advertisement for a movie or something. Then the second plane hit. The anchor stopped talking for a moment and quietly said, "Oh no." That's when I grasped the severity of what I was watching. Story 65. I was 10 and I remember thinking, I am going to have to hear about this all day, aren't I? And I was right. Story 66. I was in a history class at my local community college when someone from administration knocked on the door to inform us that classes were canceled because a plane crashed into the World Trade Center. No one was sure whether it was an accident or intentional. As I was leaving, I saw the second plane crash into the other tower on television in the cafeteria. I lived about an hour and a half north of New York City, and my mom worked less than a mile from our local airport. I was panicking because information traveled slowly at the time, and I kept trying to call her, but the phone lines to her company were overloaded. She worked for an insurance company that lost nearly its entire staff on one of the floors in their World Trade Center office. I finally got hold of her, and we met up at my grandparents' house just in time to watch a tower collapse on television. It was surreal, confusing, and terrifying. I was 20 at the time for perspective. Story 67. I was in second grade when a teacher explained what had happened. She said, "Bad people did a bad thing." I responded, "It's okay. My dad will take care of them." She laughed, and I didn't understand why at the time. Story 68. Where is my wife? She flew into the city that morning and had a meeting in Midtown. I knew she was on the ground. We eventually spoke, and she volunteered to set up a triage site near Pace with some other medical professionals. They flushed out eyes for hours. Story 69. That American hubris had come back to bite us. There was a sense that the continent was untouchable, that we could do as we pleased in the rest of the world without risk to ourselves. That ended on September 11th. Story 70. I will always remember that day because I was driving to work on the Long Island Expressway going east. I saw a few cars stopped on the side of the road with people outside their vehicles going west, and later I saw the same thing happening going east at least 3 or 4 times. I thought, wow, there are quite a few minor accidents today. I never considered that people had pulled over to discuss what was happening. I was listening to a CD, so I didn't have the radio on for any live breaking news. When I arrived at work, my colleagues asked if I had heard what happened. When they told me, I felt a bit nauseous and went into my office to check online for updates. Our company then closed early that day, and I was about 30 miles from home, with the Long Island Expressway completely shut down. As I approached the entrance, a Suffolk police officer asked where I was going. I told him I was heading home and gave him my address. He advised me to take the Long Island Expressway and provided his name in case someone stopped me. I only saw one other car that day heading into New York, which had 2 firemen in a small SUV. I recognized their uniforms. I always wondered if they were okay and wished I could have thanked them for their important work that day. Driving on the Long Island Expressway that day remains one of the most surreal moments of my life. Story 71. I was stationed in Germany and had a feeling I would need to go to the site. I tried to call, but the lines were busy. So I grabbed my 72-hour bag and walked outside. At that moment, a C-5 Galaxy was flying over my housing at a very low altitude. My first thought was, oh no, they have all the planes. It's all over. Then I remembered that Ramstein Air Base was 2 miles away and that the aircraft was approaching for a landing. Story 72. I heard about it from someone before the second period at school, shrugged, and went to my lab and visited Abercrombie's website. I didn't even bother going to CNN. That was pretty much the last normal moment of American blissful ignorance. By the end of the third period, I still hadn't seen the news and had only heard some bizarre, yet ultimately somewhat true rumors. The atmosphere in the school was completely different. It was creepy. I tried to place a call to the city, my dad's job, and heard a message saying all circuits are currently busy. Please try your call again later. That's when I thought they finished the job in reference to the 1993 attack. The vice principal confirmed everything that had happened during lunch after the fourth period, and I just cried and cried. Story 73. I was living in South Carolina at the time. Oddly, I had just started getting into Middle Eastern music because of a Middle Eastern restaurant in town that sold great vintage recordings on tape for a low price. I discovered artists like Asmahan, Faraz, and Farid Al-Atrak. I would buy them by the handful. I still have most of them. My first thought was, this is going to change everything. I knew personal freedoms would be rolled back, and I knew anti-Muslim and anti-Middle Eastern sentiment would increase significantly. I was right. I wasn't scared for myself as I was away from the center of the action. However, living in a very conservative state, I was actually afraid of driving around while listening to that music, which I did all the time. Interestingly, my boyfriend at the time worked for a military surplus store. A few months after September 11th, he and his boss went to a city a few hours away to pick up some supplies for the store. On the way back, they suddenly thought, wait, my boss is Jewish with a big beard, and I am dark with a big beard, and we have all these old missiles and military equipment in this truck. They spent the rest of the journey paranoid that they would be pulled over by overzealous local police and mistaken for terrorists. Story 74. I worked at a hotel at the time. Everyone was in the lobby watching the TV. I made my way through the crowd and saw the first tower go down. I thought it was a movie and even asked, "What movie is this?" The helicopter pilots who were staying at the hotel said it was not a movie. It was real. Story 75. I had just finished basic training earlier that summer and was attending school that winter. I walked into class and thought, I am going to war. Story 76. I woke up to screaming very early in the morning, and all the local news was showing were smoldering buildings with no additional information. We had kept hearing that Kim Jong-il was threatening to bomb the west coast of the United States and Hawaii in the weeks prior to September 11th. So at first we thought we were watching the Honolulu skyline instead of New York City. Took a few minutes for it all to set in. Story 77. I had turned for the day before and was wondering why my parents wouldn't let me watch cartoons that morning. It turns out there was a reason. Story 78. Initial reaction? I feel grief for all the innocent people caught up in geopolitical terror, but I wasn't surprised. I had already lived through the fall of the Shah of Iran, the Munich massacre, the First Iraq War, the Achille Lauro hijacking, Pan Am Flight 103, and the bombing of the Twin Towers in 1993. I distinctly remember when President Reagan sat in the White House surrounded by members of the Mujahideen, congratulating himself on creating and arming the initial factions that would become Al-Qaeda. I was quite sure American politicians were only going to make matters worse. Then I watched President Bush Jr. follow in the same thoughtless, senseless footsteps of his predecessors and make matters worse. Story 79. I was working at a newspaper in Belgium. I first heard the news at about 2 p.m. Central European Time. It seemed like every 10 minutes another plane was hijacked. I was watching the news as stories came in. I couldn't tell if each report was a new hijacking or an update to one we already knew about. Here I was, a fairly patriotic American working in Europe when my country suffered its first attack in over 50 years. I was an emotional wreck. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the offices of our parent newspaper were meters from the Twin Towers, so they had to move operations to Princeton and somehow still published a newspaper for September 12th. Our paper won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the events. Story 80. I am in the Pacific time zone. I turned on the television when I woke up at 6 a.m. and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Story 81. I just started getting interested in aviation at that point. When I saw the building on fire and then another airplane flying into the other tower, I wondered what kind of air traffic mistake could have caused that. My immediate thought wasn't that someone would deliberately do that, but it quickly became obvious that it wasn't an air traffic control error or a pilot error. At that point, I thought, oh no, the Third World War is about to start. It was confusing for everyone, I think. The events of September 11th show how Americans felt too safe at home while being completely unaware of U.S. politics abroad, which, in some ways, contributed to this situation. Story 82. I was thinking the total number of deaths would be much higher. I was doing mental math. How many floors, people per floor, multiplied by 2 buildings? I was sad to hear the total, but honestly thought it would be 10 times higher. Story 83. I remember exactly where I was when the first plane hit the World Trade Center. I walked into the office and asked if anyone else had heard the news. This was before they realized it was a terrorist attack. I felt disbelief that something like that could happen in a large city like New York City. Story 84. When the first plane hit, I thought it was pilot error and that someone had a medical emergency causing the crash. I wondered how they would put out the fire or rescue people trapped inside. By the time the second plane hit, I knew what was happening. I watched the news from start to finish, already engaged as the story unfolded. Story 85. I was utterly scared. Even though I was in the Midwest, you just couldn't be sure of what was happening. Story 86. I was in 4th grade. My teacher was a retired Marine drill instructor. I didn't know at the time, but I definitely thought he was very strict. The janitor barged in. I am assuming he was a veteran too because he didn't go into any other rooms. We turned our classroom television on just in time to see the second plane hit. The television was on for a minute or less. We were the only class in the entire elementary school that knew anything had happened, though we could not fully understand what we had witnessed. Fast forward to about 20 years later. We talked about September 11th in my college psychology class in reference to flashbulb memory. The professor and I, who was only 3 to 4 years older than me, were the only 2 people in a class of 70 who were alive on that day. Story 87. I was in the Mountain Time Zone, so I saw where the first plane hit on the news. When the second one hit, right after Brian Gumbel spoke about air control issues, I knew it was terrorists. I grabbed my belongings and went to work on the military base where I was employed as a civilian. I arrived early, and we had a meeting in our large conference room. We were all watching the small television we had and saw the towers fall. I looked at all of those soldiers and knew many would be leaving, and some would not be coming back. Story 88. I was shocked. I walked into work just as the second plane hit. I thought it was a drunk pilot or an engine failure. Never in a million years would I have imagined it was a terrorist attack. The next 6 months were the most surreal news I had ever seen. Story 89. I was getting ready for work when the second plane hit. Up to that point, it seemed like a fluke airline accident. After that, it felt like watching a horror movie. At work, most of us were in the cafeteria watching the news when the towers collapsed. Story 90. At 6 a.m., I was listening to the news on the radio as I headed out for a surf, struggling to believe what I was hearing. 2 large passenger aircraft have flown into the World Trade Center buildings. One of the towers has collapsed, and dust and debris have covered lower Manhattan. The upper floors of the second tower are on fire. Emergency responders are on the scene. The sea was smooth and glassy, and a friend paddled out a short time later to join me. We sat there on this perfect, clear, sunny day, asking each other, is this it? Did World War III start today? Felt so surreal. Story 91. Everything went down. I scrambled to find online news sites that were still active. FARK was the best place to stay updated minute by minute. Story 92. I am Mexican. That day, my parents took me and my 3 siblings across the border to renew our passports in Arizona. Apparently, they had been in line for quite some time without anyone getting in or out. Then, they canceled all the appointments, closed the consulate, and local police came to escort everyone back across the border before closing it for good. Took us months to get a new appointment. They didn't know until they arrived at a relative's house a couple of hours later and saw the news. Story 93. I wasn't very surprised, to be honest. The first time they bombed the World Trade Center, I wasn't either. I was shocked when it went from 1 jet to 2, then for a massive security failure. To give a little more insight, my father worked at the North American Aerospace Defense Command. At that time, they were conducting a drill involving terrorists flying planes into buildings in the United States. I knew that this kind of thing was something the government was preparing for. Story 94. I wasn't too disturbed. I just watched and soaked it all in without being too offended. Later, I heard suggestions that this must be Osama bin Laden and his followers, and I thought, okay, so it was Osama and his Taliban and Al-Qaeda group. I then went on with my day, not too bothered, except to feel more scared of flying in planes. That was the most negative perspective I had since that incident. Story 95. US defaultism will have a field day with this. To answer your question, I was 11, and my only thoughts were that my parents were not acting normally. Something was wrong. Story 96. I thought, how did that building fall at free fall speed? Then I considered, what were all those little flashes coming out of the windows? Next, I pondered, why did the building down the street, which a plane didn't hit at all, fall at free fall speed? Then I saw the hole in the ground in Pennsylvania and wondered, where's the plane? I also observed the roughly 16 by 16 hole at the Pentagon and questioned, a plane did that? The questions just kept coming, as there were more oddities than possibly imaginable that day. But, some individuals from Saudi Arabia did it, so. Story 97. I told my boss, I bet they'll blame it on Osama bin Laden and use it to go to war in Iraq. He responded, who's Osama bin Laden? Story 98. I was in the 4th grade when they wheeled in the televisions and let us watch the news unfold. Kids were crying and about a third of my class got picked up. It was overall pretty alarming, and it was the first time I remember asking my parents if we would be okay. Story 99. I was 13, and it was wild. I felt like, this can't be real at school. But when I got home and my parents were watching the 24-hour news cycle nonstop, it sank in. Story 100. I was in college and said to my floor mates, we're all going to have to go back to learning to farm. I don't know how to farm. The funny thing is that I kind of know how to farm now. Story 101. I was on holiday in Spain as a child. My mother is American, and I couldn't understand why she was crying. Story 102. I was at my desk as a chemical plant engineer when I received an email news bulletin from CNN about a plane striking one of the towers. I initially assumed it was a malfunction until the second tower was hit. Then I knew it had to be a planned attack. Story 103. My parents lived in a building on the other side of the Hudson River and witnessed the second plane crash. My dad used to take a train or subway that I believe crossed under the towers, and he was late that day and hadn't left home yet. Their reaction was one of relief, but also a lot of sadness for those who hadn't been as lucky. Story 104. I was on a week's paid leave and watched the whole thing unfold on TV. It was the most interesting and horrific thing I had ever seen, and I knew it would lead to war. Story 105. Shock. I was going into work. When I arrived, it was a ghost town. We closed early, went home, and huddled around the television. Story 106. I was 8 years old. I remember watching it after being released from school that day. My mom was glued to the television. Story 107. I was about 4 to 5 years old and was home watching cartoons. I thought the television broke when everything changed. My mom was helping my aunt make flower bouquets for her wedding, and I was confused when they began to sob. Story 108. I was in 3rd grade, and in the following days it was all that was in the news. I asked my parents why planes kept flying into buildings, thinking they were different planes and different buildings. Story 109. I didn't catch the news in the morning because I worked nights, so I normally woke up around noon. My waking routine was to turn on ESPN for highlights of the previous night's game. That day, instead of SportsCenter, there were burning towers and shocked anchors. I remember thinking, holy cow, they got us. I do not recall if the broadcast mentioned terrorism or if my mind just assumed that, but at that point it was clearly not accidental. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.